I'm Caroline Mercer, 29 years old, and the last time I walked into my parents' backyard without help was the afternoon my brother was celebrating his 32nd birthday. I remember stepping onto the new pool deck, feeling the boards slick under my shoes, and realizing too late that something was wrong. My feet slid, my arms flailed, and then my back slammed against the cold edge of the concrete. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of people laughing nearby, unaware that I couldn't move my legs. By the time my vision cleared, my brother was standing over me, grinning like it was all part of some show. That day changed more than my body. It rewrote every line of what I thought family meant. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when no one believed you. I grew up in a quiet Massachusetts suburb in a house that always looked perfect from the outside. My father, Richard, believed life was about discipline and appearances, never letting feelings get in the way of handling your business. My mother, Margaret, was gentle in moments, but more often her attention was tuned to keeping the peace, which in our house meant keeping my father and my brother happy. Brandon, 3 years older, had charm that could fill a room and a knack for knowing exactly how to play to our parents' expectations. If something went wrong between us, I was the one who got the lecture while he got a pat on the back. It wasn't all bad. There were family dinners, holiday gatherings, the kind of small-town rhythm that made life seem safe. But under it all was a constant balancing act where I learned early that my needs could tip the scales in the wrong direction. My father's voice was always in the back of my mind, telling me to toughen up, to stop making a fuss. My mother's comparisons to Brandon were quiet, but cutting reminders that he wouldn't be complaining about a headache or limping from a sprain or needing help with something she thought I should manage alone. By the time I left for college at 18, I had made a quiet promise to myself to build a life that didn't depend on their approval. I found a place in a little coastal town 2 hours away, started teaching, and surrounded myself with friends who didn't need me to earn their care. Still, family ties have a way of pulling you back no matter how far you've gone. Calls from my mother came with that careful mix of guilt and invitation, the kind that made saying no feel impossible. So when she told me they were hosting a big backyard barbecue for Brandon's birthday, I hesitated. 6 months had passed since I'd last seen any of them, and a part of me hoped maybe things could be different. She mentioned the new pool deck my father had built, how all of Brandon's friends would be there, how much it would mean to him if I showed up. I knew better than to expect that my presence would matter much to anyone but her. Still, I agreed, telling myself it would just be an afternoon. A few hours of polite smiles, a card slipped into his hand, and I'd be back on the road before anything could turn sour. What I didn't know that morning was how quickly old patterns can resurface, or how a single misstep, both literal and otherwise, could pull the ground right out from under you. The drive back to my parents' house took just over 2 hours, winding through towns where late summer leaves had started to turn. I arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, timing it, so the party would already be underway. Cars were lined along both sides of the street, most of them shiny SUVs and sports models I recognized from years of Brandon's friends showing off. The sun was bright, the air heavy with the smell of grilled meat drifting from the backyard. I parked at the far end of the block, letting the extra steps give me a moment to steady myself before stepping inside. My mother opened the front door before I could knock. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and a look up and down, the kind of silent inspection I'd known since childhood. "You made it." "Everyone's out back," she said, motioning for me to follow. I caught a glimpse of the living room as we passed brightly wrapped boxes piled on the coffee table, a set of new golf clubs propped against the wall, and a framed photo of what looked like a brand new watercraft. "Your father's having the jet ski delivered next week," she said with pride. I nodded and set my own card on the side table without comment. The sliding glass doors opened to a crowd spread across the new pool deck. About 30 people milled around with drinks in hand, some perched on lounge chairs, others leaning on the rail that ran along the edge. My father was at the grill tongs in hand, flipping burgers with practiced precision. Brandon stood near the center beer in one hand, animatedly telling a story to a group of men his age. He looked over when I stepped outside, flashing a broad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Little sis decided to show after all he said, pulling me into a hug that was more of a squeeze than a greeting. "Happy birthday," I answered, easing back. He gestured toward the deck. Dad had this put in. Brazilian hardwood. Cost a fortune. I moved toward the drink table, pouring a glass of water. For the next hour, I stayed on the fringes, making polite conversation with a few of the guests I knew from past gatherings. There were other women there, wives and girlfriends, who seemed just as content to keep to themselves, their small talk blending into the hum of conversation around us. Laughter and loud voices from Brandon's group carried across the deck, their stories circling back to high school days and old pranks. Eventually, his attention shifted in my direction. "Remember when we convinced Caroline the neighbor's dog had rabies?" he called out. "She wouldn't step outside for a week." The men around him laughed. Before I could turn away, another voice chimed in. "Or the time we swapped her shampoo for hair remover," one of his friends added. "She had to wear hats for a month." I felt the heat rise in my face. I stood intending to slip inside and collect my purse, but Brandon stepped into my path. "Leaving already, party's just getting started." His words were slurred, the smell of beer sharp in the warm air. "I've got a long drive," I said, trying to sidestep. He blocked me again, leaning in. "Come on, one drink, for old time's sake." I shook my head. "Not tonight, Brandon." His expression hardened, still the same as ever. I stepped past him and crossed toward the house. The section of deck leading to the sliding doors caught my attention for the wrong reason, a faint sheen on the boards that looked out of place in the sunlight. My left foot slid forward without warning. My right followed, and before I could grab the railing, the world tilted. My back struck the concrete pool edge with a force that stole my breath. Pain exploded along my spine and the back of my head. For a moment, I couldn't make sense of the sounds around me. Voices blurred together, the brightness of the sky searing my eyes. When my vision cleared, I was staring straight up, unable to move anything below my waist. "Help," I managed, my voice thin and strained. Brandon's face appeared above mine, and he was smiling. "Nice fall, Caroline. Always knew you had a flair for drama." I tried to push myself up, but my legs wouldn't respond. "I'm serious," I said louder this time. "I can't move my legs. I think I hit my back." He rolled his eyes. "You're embarrassing yourself. Get up." The crowd began to close in curiosity, flickering in their expressions. My father pushed through, looking irritated. "What's going on? Why are you on the ground?" Relief surged for a moment. I slipped. I hit the pool edge. "I can't feel my legs. I need to go to the hospital." He glanced at the deck, then back at me. "The boards are fine. Walk it off. You're making a scene." My mother came to his side, her voice low and sharp. "Enough, Caroline. You've always been jealous of your brother, but this is too much." I felt the nausea rising. The heat of the sun pressed against my face, my skin damp with sweat. My fingers tingled. "Please," I whispered, "call an ambulance." My father turned back toward the grill. My mother stepped away to speak to another guest. Brandon had already rejoined his friends. I was still lying there when a woman's voice cut through the noise, firm, clear, and close. "Excuse me, I'm a nurse. Let me through." A brunette in her 30s knelt beside me, her hand steady as she checked my pulse. "I'm Rachel. I work in the ER at Mass General. Tell me your name." "Caroline." "All right, Caroline, I need you to stay still. Where do you feel pain? My back? My head? I can't feel my legs." She pressed along my legs, asking if I could feel the pressure. I couldn't. "Can you move your toes?" "Nothing." She looked up. "I'm calling an ambulance." My mother reappeared. "That's not necessary. She just needs to get up." Rachel's tone stayed calm but firm. "Ma'am, Your daughter may have a spinal cord injury. Moving her could cause permanent damage." She pulled out her phone, giving details to the dispatcher. My father approached again now with a frown. "What's this about an ambulance?" Rachel didn't look up. "Your daughter has signs of serious spinal trauma. She's not to be moved until the paramedics arrive." I could see the shift in his expression, the first flicker of doubt. I swallowed hard. The deck was slippery, like there was oil on it. Rachel touched the boards near my feet, rubbing her fingers together. "This isn't water. Feels like deck oil." Eyes turned toward Brandon. His smile had vanished. "It was just a joke," he muttered. "I thought she'd slip into the pool." The sound of sirens grew louder, mingling with the uneasy murmur of the guests. Rachel stayed by my side, keeping others back. "They'll be here any minute, Caroline. Just breathe." The crowd began to thin, some heading toward the side gate, others lingering with uneasy glances. My mother fussed with her blouse. "Are you sure we can't just take her to urgent care?" Rachel shook her head. "Absolutely not." Two paramedics in Navy uniforms wheeled a stretcher through the gate. Rachel quickly briefed them. One, a woman named Sarah, crouched beside me. "We're going to keep your neck and back stable, then roll you onto a board. Don't try to help us move you." The process was careful, but still sent sharp pain through my spine. I gasped as they slid me onto the stretcher straps, securing me in place. Sarah placed an oxygen mask over my face. "Blood pressure's low. Let's get moving." She glanced at her partner. "Check the deck and take photos." He nodded and stepped away. They wheeled me toward the gate. I caught sight of my father standing by the grill, arms crossed, my mother beside him with her arms folded. Brandon stood apart, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Just beyond the driveway, a police cruiser was pulling in, lights flashing, but sirens silent. The ambulance doors closed, sealing off the sound of the party behind us. The ambulance moved quickly through the streets, its siren low but steady. Sarah stayed near my head, checking the monitors and adjusting the oxygen mask when needed. Her partner Mike sat across from her, securing the straps that held me in place. Every bump in the road sent a dull ache through my back. I tried to focus on Sarah's voice as she explained that they'd be taking me straight to the trauma unit at Massachusetts General. She spoke calmly, outlining what would happen once we arrived: a CT scan, likely an MRI, and specialists ready to evaluate my spine. The ride felt longer than it probably was. The only windows in the back were small and tinted, so I had no real sense of where we were. I could hear the faint murmur of Sarah speaking into her radio, updating the hospital on my condition and the circumstances of the fall. At one point, she asked me to rate my pain on a scale from 1 to 10. 9. I said the word coming out thin. She adjusted something in the IV line, telling me it might help take the edge off until we reached the hospital. When the ambulance stopped, the back doors opened to a rush of cooler air. The stretcher rolled forward, wheels clicking as we moved down the ramp and into the bright lights of the emergency entrance. Voices overlapped, staff calling out vitals, a security guard clearing the hallway, the squeak of the gurney wheels on polished floors. Sarah's voice followed me into the exam bay, handing me off to a trauma team. I caught fragments of what she said: possible spinal cord injury, fall on concrete edge, delayed medical attention at the scene, deliberate hazard suspected. Hands were on me, almost immediately lifting, checking, adjusting. A doctor introduced herself quickly before focusing on the scans they needed. The ceiling tiles passed above me as they wheeled me into the imaging room. The CT came first, the machine's hum filling the silence. The MRI took longer. I tried to keep still. As the table slid into the narrow tube, the knocking sound loud in my ears, despite the foam pads they'd given me. Back in the exam bay, a nurse adjusted my blankets. Her name was Carla, and she told me the neurosurgeon would be in soon. She checked my blood pressure and temperature, then stepped aside when a tall woman in a white coat entered. "Caroline." "I'm Dr. Martinez." she said, pulling up a stool beside my bed. She explained in measured tones that I had an incomplete spinal cord injury at the T12L1 level fractures in 2 vertebrae, with bone fragments pressing on the cord. She described the surgery they'd already started preparing for removing the fragments, relieving the pressure, and stabilizing my spine with rods and screws. I listened, the words stacking one on top of the other, until I found myself asking the question I had been holding back. Will I walk again? She didn't pause, but her answer was careful. It's too soon to know. Because it's incomplete, there is potential for recovery, but it will depend on how your body heals and your progress with rehabilitation. She stayed only long enough to answer a few more questions before standing to leave, promising she'd be there when I came out of surgery. The surgery happened that night. I drifted in and out of awareness afterward, catching glimpses of the recovery room ceiling, the beep of monitors, and the low voices of nurses checking on me. When I woke fully, morning light filtered through the blinds. A man in scrubs introduced himself as Carlos, one of the nurses assigned to me. He gave me water through a straw and told me I'd been in and out for nearly 12 hours since arriving. It wasn't long before Dr. Martinez returned. She explained that the procedure had gone as planned, the pressure relieved, and my spine stabilized. But the numbness in my legs was still there. She said it might take days or weeks before they knew the full outcome. Before she left, she mentioned that detectives were waiting to speak with me if I felt ready. I agreed. 2 women entered a short time later. They introduced themselves as Detective Sullivan and Officer Chen. Their questions moved steadily from what happened at the party to what was said afterward. I told them about the moment I slipped the fall and the instant loss of feeling in my legs. I described Brandon's reaction, my father's dismissal, and my mother's accusation that I was causing a scene. They asked how long it had been before anyone called for help. At least 15 or 20 minutes, I said, until Rachel the nurse stepped in. They took notes as I explained that Brandon admitted to putting oil on the boards. When I finished, Detective Sullivan told me they had already taken statements from Rachel, the paramedics, and several guests. They had also collected a sample from the deck that confirmed the presence of deck oil. Brandon, she said, had been taken into custody on charges of reckless endangerment, resulting in serious bodily harm. My parents were being investigated for negligence and failing to provide medical assistance. She didn't say what would happen next, only that the district attorney would be reviewing the case. After they left, the room was quiet, except for the monitor beeping beside me. No one from my family had called or come by. A social worker named Marcus arrived in the afternoon, explaining that he'd be helping plan the next steps for my recovery. He talked about inpatient rehabilitation home modifications and the possibility of needing mobility aids long term. It was a lot to take in, but I listened, asking questions when I could. That evening, the ward lights dimmed and the hallway sounds softened. I lay in the hospital bed, the reality settling heavier with each passing hour, the injury, the absence of my family, and the uncertain road ahead. Somewhere in the background, a nurse's voice called out orders to another room. My own room felt still, the kind of stillness that leaves space for every sound and thought. It was in that quiet that I realized the hardest part might not be what happened to my body, but how quickly the people who should have stood beside me had stepped away. Dr. Martinez returned the next morning carrying a tablet with my MRI images pulled up. She sat beside my bed, pointing to the damaged vertebrae and explaining the rods and screws that now stabilized my spine. Her voice stayed steady as she reminded me that recovery would depend on how my body responded in the coming months. I listened, focusing on her words rather than the images. The numbness in my legs was still there, but she said there were small signs, preserved sensation in some areas that gave her reason to keep the outlook open-ended. Later that afternoon, Detective Sullivan came back this time with a clipboard in hand. She told me the district attorney had formally filed charges. Brandon was being held for felony reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily injury. My parents were under investigation for criminal negligence and failure to provide necessary medical assistance. She asked if I was willing to give another statement more detailed this time to support the timeline they were building. I agreed. She wrote as I recounted everything from the first moment my foot slid on the deck to Rachel's arrival and the paramedics' decision to call the police. When we finished, she thanked me, saying she would keep me updated as the case moved forward. By the third day, I had my first visit from a hospital social worker. Marcus came in with a notebook and a calm demeanor, asking about my living situation, my job, and any support I had nearby. I told him about my apartment, the stairs leading up to it, and my work at the elementary school. He explained that once I was medically stable, I would likely transfer to an inpatient rehabilitation center for several weeks. He also mentioned possible modifications I might need at home: ramps, wider doorways, a bathroom I could use from a wheelchair. His list was practical, but hearing it made the situation feel heavier. Friends began to visit once I was moved from the trauma unit to a quieter floor. Linda, a fellow teacher, brought flowers and a stack of cards signed by my students. She sat by the bed, talking about small updates from school, carefully steering away from anything about my family. Others came with books, snacks, or simply to sit and keep me company. The gap left by my parents and Brandon was obvious, but I didn't mention it. Most people already knew enough from the news reports that had started circulating. The nights were the hardest. The hum of machines was constant, but the hallway was quiet after visiting hours. One evening, as I lay awake, I heard a soft knock, and Rachel stepped in. She was still in her scrubs, holding a paper bag with the logo of a bakery down the street. "Thought you could use something better than hospital dessert," she said, placing it on the table. We talked for a while about her shift, about how quickly things had unfolded that day at the party. She admitted she had worried my family might resist the ambulance all the way to the end. "I've seen people delay care before," she said, "but never in a case this clear." Before leaving, she squeezed my hand and told me she'd check in again when she could. Dr. Martinez monitored my progress daily. She celebrated the smallest changes, like the faint twitch in my right thigh muscle or the return of partial sensation along my hips. She explained that these were encouraging signs, but we had to be patient. She also reminded me that even with improvement, I would need to prepare for a long rehabilitation process. I nodded, taking in the balance of her optimism and realism. By the end of the first week, Marcus arranged a meeting with a personal injury attorney named Michael Greenberg. He arrived with a slim briefcase in a direct but courteous manner. After introducing himself, he explained the civil side of what had happened. The criminal charges would address the wrongdoing, but a lawsuit could help ensure I had the resources to manage lifelong medical costs, lost wages, and necessary care. He asked if I was willing to pursue action against my family. I hesitated, but when he laid out the financial realities of spinal cord injuries, I agreed to let him start the process. The following day, Michael returned with documents for me to review. He said my parents' homeowner's insurance might cover some damages, but for full compensation, we would likely need to seek settlement from their personal assets as well. He spoke in practical terms, never pressing, but making sure I understood each step. Before he left, he promised to handle communication so I wouldn't need to speak directly with my family during the process. Physical therapy began sooner than I expected. A therapist named David came in with a lightweight set of braces and explained that they'd start with supported sitting and basic transfer techniques. The first time they moved me from the bed to a padded chair, every muscle I could still control strained with effort. David encouraged me, pointing out each movement I managed on my own. Even so, the exhaustion afterward was unlike anything I'd felt before. One evening while I was resting after therapy, Marcus came back with an update. The district attorney had scheduled an initial court date for Brandon, and my parents had been formally charged. He said it was rare for cases like mine to move so quickly, but the evidence, physical, medical, and testimonial, was unusually strong. I thanked him for letting me know, though I didn't ask for more details about their situation. There would be time for that later. As the second week in the hospital began, I found a rhythm in the day's morning rounds with Dr. Martinez therapy sessions, visits from friends, quiet evenings broken by the occasional nurse checking vitals. The investigation and legal steps were still moving outside those walls, but inside my focus narrowed to each small piece of progress. It was clear the path forward would be long, but with each passing day, the uncertainty of those first hours at the party began to give way to something steadier. 2 weeks after the surgery, Dr. Martinez came into my room with a discharge packet in her hand. She explained that my next step would be moving to an inpatient rehabilitation center. I'd already met one of their coordinators, a woman named Claire Patterson, who had walked me through the schedule mornings filled with physical therapy afternoons, focused on occupational skills and counseling sessions in between. It sounded exhausting, but necessary. The transfer was set for the following morning. The rehab facility was only 20 minutes from the hospital, but it felt like a different world. Instead of white walls and the constant hum of machines, there were wide hallways with handrails, therapy gyms filled with specialized equipment, and patient rooms arranged around common spaces. My primary therapist, David, met me on my first day. He explained their goal plainly to help me regain as much function as possible and to teach me to live independently with whatever limitations remained. The first few sessions focused on sitting balance and building strength in my upper body. David showed me how to use my arms and shoulders to shift from the bed to a wheelchair. Every move required concentration. Muscles I hadn't used much before were sore by the end of each day. In occupational therapy, I learned how to adapt daily routines using a long-handled reacher to pick things up, adjusting my kitchen setup to cook from a seated position, and practicing getting in and out of a simulated shower. There were group sessions, too, where patients shared tips and progress. That's where I met Tara, a woman close to my age who had been injured in a car accident 2 years earlier. She used braces and crutches for short distances, a wheelchair for longer ones. Over coffee in the dining area, she told me about her early months in rehab, the setbacks, the small victories, and the point when she realized life could still hold purpose. Listening to her made the long days feel a little less overwhelming. Outside of therapy, Michael kept me updated on the civil case. He'd already filed the paperwork naming both my parents and Brandon. Their homeowner's insurance company had been notified, and Michael expected negotiations to begin once the initial criminal hearings were underway. He was careful not to overpromise, but said the evidence left little room for dispute. I signed the documents he brought, each signature a reminder of how far this had moved beyond the family I once knew. News from the criminal side came through Marcus, who continued to visit me weekly. Brandon was still in custody awaiting trial. My parents had been released on bond but were restricted from contacting me. It explained the silence. Marcus said the prosecutors planned to offer plea deals, but he didn't yet know the terms. I thanked him for keeping me informed, even when the details were hard to hear. 3 weeks into rehab, I experienced my first flicker of movement in my left thigh. David noticed it during a supported standing exercise between the parallel bars. It wasn't much, just a small contraction, but it was enough to pause the session and mark the progress. Dr. Martinez, who checked in periodically, said these moments were encouraging, though recovery would still be slow. The next week, I felt tingling in my lower legs, sometimes like pins and needles, other times just warmth. Each change was noted, tracked, and folded into the plan. Friends continued to visit when they could. Linda brought her laptop one evening so we could video chat with some of my students. Their excitement filled the room, and for a moment I forgot about the monitors and the chair beneath me. Rachel visited too, usually, after a long shift at the hospital. She never stayed long, but her presence was steady. She'd ask about therapy, share a story from work, and then leave me with a smile or a quiet word of encouragement. One afternoon, Michael arrived with a file thick enough to bend the cover. He had begun depositions, starting with witnesses from the party. Rachel's account matched mine almost exactly, and the paramedics had documented the delay in seeking care. Several guests confirmed Brandon's admission about the deck oil. The evidence was stacking in a way that made Michael confident we could reach a substantial settlement without going to trial. He still cautioned patients civil cases moved at their own pace. By the 6th week, I could manage short periods of walking between the bars with heavy braces and David's support. Each step felt deliberate, my upper body doing more of the work than my legs. In occupational therapy, I practiced navigating tight spaces in a wheelchair, opening heavy doors, and transferring into a mock car setup. Every skill learned here would make life at home easier, but the idea of returning there still felt distant. One evening after therapy, Marcus came by with a small envelope. It was from the district attorney's office, outlining the dates for the upcoming plea hearings. Brandon's was scheduled first. My parents' hearing would follow. Marcus explained that I could attend if I wished, but it wasn't required. I said I'd think about it, though the idea of seeing them in that setting was something I wasn't ready to decide on yet. The days at rehab settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with exercises that left me sweating. Afternoons brought new challenges in daily living tasks, and evenings were quieter time to read, write, or talk with the other patients. The progress was gradual, but it was there measured not only in physical gains, but in the way I began to picture a life beyond these walls. One night, after the ward had gone still, I sat by the window in my wheelchair, looking out at the lights of the city. It struck me that each part of this journey, the accident, the hospital, this place was leading me towards something I couldn't yet see. The uncertainty was still there, but so was a sense that I was moving, however slowly, toward a point where I could stand on my own terms again. By my 8th week in rehab, the hearings for Brandon and my parents were set to begin. Marcus came by with the official notice, laying the papers on my bedside table. He asked again if I planned to attend. I told him I wasn't sure. My energy was going into therapy, and the thought of sitting in a courtroom across from them was something I still couldn't picture without a knot tightening in my chest. Michael visited 2 days later with updates on the civil case. Negotiations with the insurance company had started, and he'd also opened discussions with my parents' attorney about liquidating some of their assets. "The evidence is strong," he said, flipping open his folder. "Between the witness accounts, your medical documentation, and Brandon's own admission, there's little room for them to argue." He warned me it might take months to finalize even with their cooperation. In therapy, David had me walking short distances with a walker and heavy braces. Each step felt deliberate, my upper body working harder than my legs. He was patient, reminding me that the progress, no matter how slow, mattered. In occupational therapy, Claire Patterson introduced me to adaptive tools I'd likely use for the rest of my life: a lightweight wheelchair that could fold for transport, a modified cutting board for the kitchen, and a shower chair with side supports. Learning to use them was a mix of trial and error, but every small success made the prospect of returning home feel more manageable. One rainy afternoon, Tara stopped by my room. She'd just returned from a follow-up appointment of her own. We sat by the window watching the rain beat against the glass. "The first year's the hardest," she said quietly, "but you'll be surprised by what you can adapt to." Her words carried a weight I trusted, and I found myself holding on to them in the quieter hours. When the day of Brandon's hearing arrived, I stayed at the rehab center, but asked Marcus to let me know how it went. He called that evening. Brandon had accepted a plea deal, 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years on probation. My parents' hearing was set for the following week. I listened without responding right away, the details settling into place slowly. Part of me felt relief at the certainty of it. Another part recognized that these legal outcomes wouldn't change the years that had led to that day. The next week, my parents appeared in court. Marcus told me they'd agreed to plead guilty to criminal negligence and failure to provide necessary medical assistance. Their sentence was 2 years of probation, 400 hours of community service each, and mandatory counseling. It was a lighter outcome than Brandon's, but still more than I'd ever imagined when I lay on that pool deck, unable to move. By my 10th week in rehab, Michael returned with news. The insurance payout had reached its maximum limit, $1 million, and my parents had agreed to sell their house to fund an additional $2 million in a trust for my ongoing care. It's enough to cover your medical needs, home modifications, and a safety net for the future, he said. Hearing the numbers didn't erase the reality of why they were necessary, but it did bring a sense of stability I hadn't felt in months. Dr. Martinez visited to check on my progress before I left rehab. She examined my legs, noting the improved muscle activity in my thighs and hips. "You've made remarkable gains," she said. "It's still early and you may see more improvement in the months ahead." Her encouragement was steady, grounded in the reality of my condition, and it meant more than I could say. As my discharge date approached, the rehab team gathered to walk me through the plan for going home. My apartment had been modified while I was away, ramps at the entry, widened doorways, and a fully accessible bathroom. A part-time caregiver would come by during the week to help with tasks that still challenged me. The school district had offered me a position as a curriculum specialist, allowing me to work from home most days. On my last evening there, I sat in the dining area with Tara, sipping coffee. We talked about the first days after leaving rehab, the adjustments, and the unexpected moments that could still feel overwhelming. "It's a different kind of independence," she said, "but it's still yours." Her words stayed with me as I packed the next morning, each item folded into a bag that would follow me into the next stage. The van that took me home felt both familiar and strange. As we pulled into my street, I could see the ramp leading to my door, the work of friends who had coordinated it while I was away. Stepping and wheeling into my own space again was a quiet victory. It didn't erase what had happened, but it marked a shift. I was home on different terms, but still my own. That first night back, I sat in my living room with the lights low, the hum of the refrigerator in the background. The trust, the settlement, the sentences, all of it had brought a form of justice. What came next was mine to shape. The first weeks at home settled into a rhythm that was both new and strangely familiar. Mornings began with the sound of the kettle on the stove and sunlight pooling across the living room rug. The ramp at my front door was sturdy under the wheels of my chair, and the widened doorway frames no longer caught at my shoulders as I moved through the house. Every small detail reminded me of the work it had taken to get here. The part-time caregiver, Denise, arrived each weekday just before 9. She helped with tasks that still required more balance than I had: laundry, grocery runs, lifting heavy cookware, but she never hovered. "You set the pace," she'd say, and I believed her. I learned to move around my kitchen with the modified tools Claire had introduced to me in therapy, chopping vegetables on the adaptive board and sliding pots carefully across the counter became part of my routine. It wasn't the way I used to do things, but it was still me doing them. Work began slowly. The school district sent me my first set of curriculum outlines to review. Most of it could be done from the dining table, the laptop angled so I could look out the window between sections. It felt good to be useful again, my mind as engaged as it had been before the accident. The calls from colleagues were warm and steady, never pressing, just checking in to see how I was managing. One Friday afternoon, Marcus stopped by unannounced. He'd been in the neighborhood after meeting with a client. We sat in the living room, mugs of coffee in our hands. They've started their community service, he told me. He meant my parents. The image of them working under the supervision of the county's program was one I wasn't ready to dwell on, so I let the conversation drift toward other things, his daughter's college search, the warm weather expected over the weekend. 2 weeks later, Michael called with an update on the trust account. "Everything's finalized now," he said. "The funds are in place, and the terms protect you from any interference." His voice carried that calm assurance I'd come to depend on during the legal process. It was a quiet relief knowing that part of the battle was closed. I saw Tara again when I attended a follow-up appointment at the rehab center. She was further along in her own recovery, walking short distances with only a cane. We found a bench in the courtyard afterward. "The first few months out are the trickiest," she said, "but it gets easier to breathe in your own space again." I told her she'd been right so far. In early spring, Dr. Martinez came to my home for a scheduled visit. She tested the muscle tone in my legs and the range of motion in my hips, making notes on her tablet. "You're holding steady," she said. "That's a good place to be right now." We discussed the next phase short sessions with a local therapy clinic to maintain strength and prevent strain on my upper body. Denise adjusted her hours as I grew more confident in managing on my own. By April, I was handling mornings without assistance, moving from bed to chair, making breakfast, and starting work before she arrived. Friends began stopping by on weekends, filling the house with familiar voices. The rooms felt less like a space I was adapting to, and more like a home again. One afternoon, as I was sorting through mail, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note in my mother's script. It was brief apologies, a line about hoping I was well, and an offer to talk when I was ready. I set it aside without answering. There was no anger in the decision, just a recognition that the timing wasn't right. The garden in my small backyard began to green again with the change of season. Denise helped me set up raised beds, and I planted herbs and a few vegetables. The scent of fresh soil and the feel of sunlight on my face became a part of my afternoons. It was a simple pleasure, but one I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. Life was quieter than it had been before the accident, but it wasn't empty. The routines I built, the work I returned to, and the people who remained constant were shaping something steady. It was different from the life I had known, but it was my own. By the time summer settled in, the days felt easier. My mornings were my own quiet coffee by the window, the hum of the neighborhood just waking up. Work was steady, but never rushed. The garden grew in thick and green, the scent of basil drifting through the kitchen when the windows were open. I had found a rhythm that didn't feel fragile anymore. Marcus stopped by one evening with his daughter, bringing a basket of peaches from a farm outside town. We sat on the back porch, the air warm but not heavy. Conversation wandered easily. It struck me that the people who'd stood beside me through the hardest months didn't need grand gestures. They showed up in ways that mattered most. One afternoon in late July, I received another letter from my mother. This one was longer. She wrote about her own father mistakes she'd never confronted and how quickly pride could harden into something worse. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright. Instead, she said she was willing to listen if I ever wanted to speak. I read it twice before folding it away. It was the first time her words felt less like an explanation and more like an opening. The trust account stayed untouched except for the few modifications to make the house more comfortable. Knowing it was there brought a kind of quiet security I hadn't known before. I didn't need to look over my shoulder for someone trying to undo it. That part of the story was finished. In August, Claire invited me to the rehab center's open house. I went partly to see her, partly to watch others, just beginning their own recoveries. Tara was there too, leaning on her cane but laughing easily. We stood together for a while watching a young man maneuver a wheelchair over the practice ramp. "You forget how far you've come," Tara said. She was right. Life didn't return to what it was before, but it grew into something solid and my own. I no longer measured each day against what I had lost. Instead, I counted the things I could still do, the connections that stayed, the small moments that made up a life worth living. If there's anything these months have taught me, it's that strength isn't loud. It's found in showing up for yourself even when no one else does. It's in protecting your peace, setting your boundaries, and knowing you deserve the life you've built. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you hold on to your own worth, even when others can't see it. And if this story stayed with you, I'd be glad for you to share it so it might reach someone who needs to hear it.